I never thought I'd be the kind of man who hides cameras in his own home. At 73 years old, with a lifetime of believing that trust was the foundation of everything worth building, the idea of surveilling my own wife felt like a betrayal of every principle I'd held sacred. But 3 weeks ago, something fundamental shifted in the house Constance and I had shared for 46 years. Something I couldn't name but felt in my bones every single time she moved through rooms like a stranger wearing a familiar face. The woman I'd loved since she was 24 started closing doors that used to stay open, whispering into her phone in the garden where she thought the wind would carry her secrets beyond my hearing, and smiling at her screen with a lightness and joy I hadn't seen directed at me in what felt like months, maybe years if I was being brutally honest with myself. I told myself repeatedly that I was being paranoid, that retirement had given me too much empty time to notice shadows that weren't really there, to manufacture problems where none existed simply because I needed something to solve, some purpose to fill the endless days. But when you've shared a bed with someone for nearly 5 decades, when you've weathered deaths and births and financial crises and health scares together, you develop an instinct for when something changes, when the rhythm you've danced to for so long suddenly shifts into a tempo you don't recognize. So I did something I never imagined myself capable of doing. Before I continue, you need to subscribe to Deserved Revenge, because what I'm about to reveal will shock you. Hit that subscribe button now. I ordered 4 small surveillance cameras online, waited anxiously for them to arrive in plain brown packaging that wouldn't raise questions, and on a Tuesday morning when Constance left for what she said was her weekly book club meeting, I installed them throughout our home with shaking hands and a sick feeling in my stomach. I placed one in the living room, hidden inside an antique clock I'd inherited from my father. Another went in the kitchen, disguised as part of the smoke detector that already hung from the ceiling. The third I positioned in our bedroom, tucked into a picture frame that held a photograph of us from our honeymoon in Niagara Falls, back when we were young and certain that love alone could sustain us through anything. The fourth camera, the one that felt most invasive somehow, I installed in Constance's craft room, the space she'd claimed as entirely hers over the past year, the one room in our house where she gently but firmly established that I didn't need to enter unless invited. I disguised it as part of a decorative shelf arrangement, just another small black object among her collection of vintage sewing notions and fabric scraps. Each installation felt like a small death, a murder of the trust we'd supposedly built. And yet I couldn't stop myself. The need to know what was happening, to understand why the woman sleeping beside me had become a mystery, overwhelmed every other consideration. My hands trembled as I positioned each camera, adjusted angles, tested connections on my phone to make sure I could access the feeds remotely. I felt simultaneously like a traitor and a detective, like I was protecting myself and destroying something precious all at once. Before I dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing more. The first 2 days of footage revealed nothing unusual, nothing that justified the sick guilt sitting heavy in my chest every time I looked at Constance across the dinner table. She did normal, everyday things that any retired woman might do. She folded laundry while watching cooking shows on the small television in the living room, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been managing a household for decades. She talked on the phone with her sister Margaret about their mother's upcoming 85th birthday party, discussing menu options and whether they should hire a photographer or just rely on everyone's phones like they usually did. She watered her extensive collection of houseplants with the same gentle attention she'd always given growing things, talking to them softly in a way she probably thought I couldn't hear from my office down the hall. She prepared meals, read magazines, did crossword puzzles at the kitchen table, lived what appeared to be an utterly ordinary life. I felt increasingly foolish watching her exist in her own space, suspicious of a woman who was simply going about her daily routine without any awareness that her husband had transformed their home into a surveillance state. Maybe the distance I'd been feeling was just the natural settling that happens when passion cools into companionship, when the intense heat of young love banks down into something steadier and less consuming. Maybe I was the problem, projecting my own fears of becoming irrelevant and purposeless onto a wife who'd done absolutely nothing to deserve my suspicion. I almost deleted everything on the third day, I almost took all the cameras down, boxed them up, and returned them with some excuse about ordering the wrong item. I almost confessed to Constance what I'd done, prepared to accept her anger and disappointment as just punishment for my paranoia. But something stopped me from following through on any of those almost actions. Call it intuition, though that seems too generous a word for what might have just been stubborn pride. Call it the same instinct that woke me at 3 a.m. drenched in sweat and certain that something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of my marriage, that the life I thought I was living was somehow different from the life that was actually happening around me. On that third day, I checked the bedroom camera feed during my afternoon walk, pulling out my phone while sitting on the park bench where Constance and I used to feed ducks together before her interests changed, before she started finding reasons to do activities separately rather than as a couple. What I saw on that small screen made my blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with the sharp October wind cutting through my jacket. Constance was in our bedroom, standing near the dresser where she kept her jewelry and personal items. But she wasn't alone. A man I'd never seen before in my life sat on the edge of our bed, the same bed we'd bought together 30 years ago after my back problems started requiring a firmer mattress. He appeared younger than me by at least a decade, maybe more, dressed casually in dark jeans and a gray sweater, and he was holding something in his hands that I couldn't quite make out clearly on the phone's small display. Constance stood in front of him, not touching him but positioned close enough that the physical space between them felt charged with an intimacy that made my chest constrict painfully. They were talking, their mouths moving in what appeared to be relaxed conversation, though I couldn't make out any actual words through my phone speaker that I'd turned down low to avoid drawing attention from other park visitors. Then Constance laughed, a full-throated, joyful sound I hadn't heard her make in what felt like years, and reached out to touch the man's shoulder with the kind of casual, comfortable affection that only comes from knowing someone well, from having touched them many times before without needing to think about whether it was appropriate. The gesture was small, barely lasting more than a second or two, but it communicated volumes about their relationship, whatever that relationship might be. The man looked up at her in response to her touch and smiled with unmistakable warmth, genuine fondness, clearly visible even through the grainy camera footage. His entire face transformed with that smile, and I could see that he cared about her, that whatever was happening between them involved real emotion rather than just physical attraction. Who was this person? How long had he been coming to my house, sitting on my bed, sharing private moments with my wife while I obediently took my prescribed afternoon walks or visited the library or did the grocery shopping that Constance had suddenly stopped wanting to accompany me on 6 months ago? How many times had she encouraged me to get out of the house, to stay active, to maintain my routines, all while knowing that my absence created space for this stranger to enter our home and our lives? The questions multiplied in my mind faster than I could process them, each one more painful than the last. I didn't confront Constance that evening when I returned home from my walk, though every instinct screamed at me to demand immediate answers, to throw my phone in her face with the evidence of her betrayal frozen on the screen. I couldn't find the right words, couldn't figure out how to explain that I'd been secretly surveilling her without making myself sound like exactly the kind of paranoid, controlling old man I was terrified of becoming in my declining years. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd violated her privacy to discover her violation of our marriage vows, that my moral high ground was built on foundations of deception just as questionable as whatever she was hiding. So instead of confrontation, I sat across from her at our dinner table, mechanically pushing pot roast and carrots around my plate while she talked about her day at book club with the kind of animated enthusiasm she rarely showed when discussing our shared life. She described the discussion about some novel I'd never heard of, something about family secrets and generational trauma, using expressive hand gestures and bright eyes that made her look years younger than her 71 years. She seemed genuinely happy, lighter somehow, glowing with a contentment that apparently had nothing whatsoever to do with me or our marriage. That realization hurt more than catching her with a stranger had. The affair, if that's what it was, I could almost understand from a logical perspective. People grow apart, desire fades, opportunities present themselves, but the happiness, the joy radiating from her as she recounted details of her supposedly innocent afternoon. That felt like a deeper betrayal because it meant she'd found something outside our marriage that I could no longer provide. I watched her mouth move, heard individual words about characters and plot developments, and someone named Darla's controversial interpretation of the ending, but my brain couldn't quite process the meaning because all I could think about was the man in our bedroom. The way Constance had touched his shoulder with such easy familiarity, the sound of her unfamiliar laughter that apparently required his presence rather than mine to emerge. Was any of what she was telling me actually true? Had there really been a book club meeting today? Or was that just convenient cover for whatever was genuinely happening in my house while I wandered through my retirement, like an irrelevant ghost haunting his own life? The questions circled endlessly, making me feel dizzy and slightly nauseous. I wanted desperately to grab her hands across the table, to force her to stop this cheerful performance and tell me the truth about everything. I wanted to scream until my throat was raw. I wanted to rewind our entire marriage to some earlier point where we still told each other everything that mattered before secrets and silence became the invisible third presence constantly sitting between us. Instead, I heard myself say, "That sounds really interesting, dear," in a voice that sounded normal enough that Constance didn't appear to notice anything wrong, and I helped her clear the dishes afterward, our long-practiced dance of domestic cooperation continuing smoothly, while my interior world crumbled into dust and confusion. That night, sleep proved completely impossible despite my exhaustion. Constance breathed evenly and peacefully beside me in the bed we'd shared for so many years, her back turned toward me in the position she'd gradually adopted over the past year, curled away protectively like she was guarding something I wasn't permitted to access or even ask about anymore. The physical distance was only 12 inches, maybe less, but it felt enormous, unbridgeable, a chasm that had opened so gradually I hadn't noticed until I was already standing on the opposite edge wondering how we'd gotten here. I stared at our ceiling, at the familiar water stain shaped vaguely like a rabbit that we'd been meaning to fix for 3 years, and tried desperately to remember exactly when we'd stopped being a genuine we, when the space between our bodies in bed had transformed from comfortable into cold, from intimate into merely functional. Had I missed obvious warning signs along the way? Had there been specific moments when Constance had reached out, attempted connection, only to find me too absorbed in my own routines and preoccupations to notice her needs? Retirement had been significantly harder than I'd anticipated, the sudden absence of professional purpose and daily structure leaving me unmoored and uncertain. The long, empty days stretched endlessly, and while Constance seemed to fill hers easily with hobbies and social connections and mysterious activities, I'd struggled to find genuine meaning in crossword puzzles and afternoon walks and the countless small tasks that ate up time without providing actual fulfillment. Maybe I'd become fundamentally boring to her, I thought, staring into the darkness. Maybe I'd stopped being the man she'd fallen in love with and married, and this stranger spending time in our bedroom represented everything I'd failed to be or become. The thought made me feel ancient and obsolete, like a piece of outdated furniture she'd kept around, out of obligation and habit, but no longer truly wanted or valued. At 2:30 in the morning, I finally gave up entirely on sleep and went to my small office. The room where I used to work remotely before retirement had transformed the desk into just another horizontal surface for collecting dust and unsorted mail. I pulled up the camera feeds on my desktop computer, the larger screen making details clearer, and began methodically scrolling through the past 3 days of saved footage, with grim determination to understand what was actually happening in my marriage. There he was again, the stranger whose name I didn't know, appearing on the bedroom camera feed from 2 days earlier, during the hours when I'd been at my quarterly doctor's appointment discussing cholesterol levels and blood pressure medications. Constance had insisted rather firmly that I go alone to that appointment, saying she had important things to handle around the house, and I'd actually felt grateful at the time not to subject her to another boring medical discussion. Now I understood with painful clarity what those important things had actually been, what had required my convenient absence. If you're still with me, you won't believe what happens next. Drop a comment below with your country so I know you're here. They sat together on our bed again in the footage, their body language comfortable and familiar, looking through what appeared to be photo albums, the actual physical kind that people used to keep before everything became digital. I could see Constance pointing at specific pictures, clearly telling stories I couldn't hear but could easily imagine, narrating our shared history to this stranger like he had some right to know the intimate details of our life together. Our honeymoon in Niagara Falls, where the hotel had accidentally given us a room with a broken heater, and we'd spent 3 days huddled under blankets laughing about our romantic misadventure. The modest first house we'd scraped together enough money to buy when I'd gotten my first significant promotion. The elaborate garden parties we used to host every summer before our friends started dying or moving away to retirement communities in warmer states. She was sharing all of it, handing over pieces of our accumulated decades, like they belonged to this man too, like he deserved access to memories that should have been exclusively ours. Then I saw something on the screen that made my hands freeze completely on the keyboard, my fingers hovering uselessly above the keys. The stranger reached down into a black messenger bag sitting beside our bed and pulled out an expensive-looking camera, the professional kind, with an enormous lens and multiple buttons and dials. He began systematically photographing the photo albums, while Constance carefully held each page open and flat, the two of them working together with the practiced coordination of people who'd done this specific task multiple times before. What exactly were they doing? Was he somehow helping her document and preserve our memories for some legitimate purpose I couldn't fathom, or was something else happening here? Something darker that I couldn't quite understand, but felt instinctively was wrong, and violated boundaries I hadn't even known needed protecting? I watched them work together for over an hour of footage, methodical and focused and efficient, until finally the man carefully packed up his professional camera equipment, gave Constance a long hug that lasted several seconds too long to be merely friendly, and left through our back door like he'd done it hundreds of times before, like he knew exactly which boards creaked and how to avoid them, like our house had become familiar territory to him. The casual comfort of that exit bothered me almost as much as anything else I'd witnessed, the implied routine and repetition suggesting this wasn't a new development, but rather an established pattern I'd somehow remained oblivious to, despite living in the same house and supposedly sharing the same life. I made a deliberate decision to stay home the following day instead of maintaining my usual routines. When Constance asked over breakfast why I wasn't planning to take my customary morning walk through the neighborhood, I told her my left knee was bothering me more than usual, which wasn't entirely a fabrication since everything hurt at 73. My entire body, essentially a collection of minor complaints and deteriorations I'd learned to mostly ignore as the inevitable price of aging. She looked appropriately concerned, asked whether I needed her to pick up anything from the pharmacy or wanted her to call my doctor's office, then retreated to her craft room with a steaming cup of herbal tea and her tablet, the door clicking shut with a soft finality that had become entirely routine over the past year. I settled into the living room with a thick biography I'd been meaning to read for months, opened it to a random page, and proceeded not to read a single word while actually watching the craft room camera feed on my phone, waiting with anxious anticipation to see what Constance did when she believed herself to be completely alone and unobserved in her private sanctuary. For the first hour, absolutely nothing unusual or suspicious happened, and I began to feel foolish again for my elaborate surveillance scheme. Constance worked peacefully on one of her quilts, the intricate geometric pattern spread across her large work table, her experienced fingers moving, with the practiced confidence that comes from decades of dedication to a craft. I'd always genuinely admired her hands, the way they could transform random scraps of fabric into beautiful, meaningful objects, could create order and pattern from chaos with nothing but needle and thread and patient attention. She'd made elaborate quilts for all 3 of our children when they'd gotten married, personalized ones incorporating colors and symbols meaningful to each couple. She'd created smaller versions for each grandchild when they were born, pouring love and intention into every single stitch in a way that made my own clumsy expressions of affection feel inadequate by comparison. Watching her work should have been peaceful and reassuring, a comforting reminder of the talented, creative woman I'd fallen in love with so many years ago. Instead, it felt like watching a complete stranger, someone I'd lived beside for 49 years without ever truly knowing or understanding in any deep way. Then her cell phone rang, the generic chime cutting through the silence of her workspace. She answered immediately, almost like she'd been waiting for this specific call, and even without audio, I could clearly see her entire demeanor transform in an instant. Her shoulders relaxed. Her face softened into an expression of warmth. She smiled, that unfamiliar smile I'd now seen multiple times on camera footage, the one that never seemed to appear when she looked at me anymore. She talked animatedly for several minutes, gesturing expressively with her free hand, laughing twice in that full, uninhibited way that sounded foreign to my ears now. Then, in a movement that made my stomach drop sickeningly, she reached carefully under her work table and pulled out a shoebox I'd absolutely never seen before in all my years of occasionally visiting her craft space. She opened it with obvious reverence, like it contained something precious and fragile, and began slowly removing items while still engaged in her phone conversation. Photographs, dozens of them. But these weren't pictures of our family or our shared history. These were old photographs, black and white, and faded color images from what looked like the 1950s and 60s, showing people I didn't recognize at all, despite having met virtually everyone important in Constance's life over our nearly 5 decades together. She held the mysterious photographs up to her phone's camera one by one, like she was displaying them for whoever was on the other end of the call to see and respond to. Her expression cycled fluidly through emotions I couldn't fully read, from the grainy camera footage, but that looked like sadness, deep nostalgia, and something that resembled profound grief. Who were these unknown people captured in aging photographs? Why had I never seen these particular images before, despite Constance's general habit of displaying family photos throughout our house? Why was she hiding them carefully under her work table like they were contraband, like dangerous secrets too risky to share with her own husband? The phone conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes while I sat frozen in my chair, barely breathing. My unopened book, completely forgotten. When the call finally ended, Constance carefully returned all the photographs to their shoebox, held the closed box against her chest for a long moment, with her eyes pressed shut tightly, then tucked it back into its hiding place, beneath the work table. She sat motionless for almost a full minute afterward, just staring at her hands resting on the quilt pattern, before finally taking a deep breath and resuming her sewing like absolutely nothing significant had just occurred. I remained frozen in my living room chair, the biography sliding off my lap onto the floor with a heavy thud that should have brought Constance out to investigate the noise. She didn't emerge from her craft room to check whether I was okay. She didn't call out to ask what had fallen. She simply continued her quilting like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just confirmed beyond any doubt that she was keeping significant secrets from me, that our marriage had somehow become a careful performance we were both participating in, without ever acknowledging that the script had fundamentally changed. I wanted desperately to storm into that room and demand immediate answers. I wanted to confront her directly with all the evidence of her deception I'd accumulated, to throw the cameras and the footage in her face and shout that I knew something was happening, that I wasn't the oblivious old fool she apparently assumed I was. But paralyzing fear stopped me from taking any action. Fear that if I confronted her now, I'd learn something I could never unknow, that whatever fragile pretense of normalcy we still maintained would shatter completely and irreparably, leaving me with nothing but the raw truth, which might somehow be worse than this agonizing uncertainty I was currently living with. So I picked up my book from the floor, found my place again, and continued the charade of normalcy, pretending to read while my mind spun endlessly with questions I was too afraid to ask out loud. Before I continue, you need to subscribe to Deserved Revenge, because what I'm about to reveal will shock you. Hit that subscribe button now. At dinner that evening, Constance seemed quieter than usual, more distracted and distant. She kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, like she was trying to solve a complicated problem or working up the courage to say something difficult and potentially relationship-altering. My heart raced uncomfortably every time our eyes met across the table. Did she somehow know about the cameras I'd installed? Had she discovered my spying despite my careful precautions? Was she preparing to confess about the stranger? About the hidden photographs? About whatever parallel life she'd been living right alongside our marriage? The tension felt suffocating, thick enough that I could barely swallow my food. Neither of us spoke much beyond the absolute minimum required for basic politeness, and the silence between us felt different from our usual comfortable, quiet, charged with unspoken words and approaching revelations that would change everything once they finally emerged into the open air between us. The confession came 3 days later, arriving in a form I could never have anticipated despite all my surveillance and suspicion and desperate attempts to understand what was happening. I was in the kitchen making my usual morning coffee, going through the automatic motions of measuring grounds and pouring water, when Constance appeared silently in the doorway wearing the pale blue dress she'd worn on our very first date over 50 years ago, the one she'd somehow kept all these years, despite changing sizes and styles and passing through entire eras of fashion. It still fit her body, though differently now, hanging on her thinner frame in a way that spoke eloquently of time past and bodies inevitably changed by age. She looked simultaneously beautiful and terrifying standing there in that doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her like a penitent preparing for confession, her eyes already wet with tears that hadn't yet fallen but clearly would soon. She said my full name, William, not Bill, like she'd called me for the past several decades, and I knew immediately from her tone that whatever was coming would fundamentally hurt, would alter something essential between us that could never be restored to its original state. I set down my coffee mug with exaggerated care, focusing intently on that simple physical action because I couldn't bring myself to focus on her face, on the enormous weight of whatever truth was clearly about to reshape my understanding of our entire shared life. She asked quietly if we could talk, really talk for once, and led me silently to the living room where we sat on opposite ends of our worn couch with what felt like the entire accumulated width of our complicated history stretching between us. Then, speaking slowly and carefully like each word caused physical pain, she told me about Nathan. Not a lover, as I'd feared. Not an affair that would destroy our marriage in the conventional way I'd been imagining. Nathan was her brother, her younger brother, whose existence I'd never known about because she'd never mentioned him even once in 49 years of marriage. 49 years of supposedly sharing our lives completely. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. A brother, a whole human being, a member of her immediate family, kept secret from me for our entire relationship. What else didn't I know about the woman I'd spent half a century with? Constance's voice shook as she explained that Nathan had been born when she was 12 years old, the surprise late baby that her conservative, image-conscious parents hadn't planned for and weren't emotionally or practically equipped to handle properly. He'd been different from the very start, she said, what people called slow or simple back in those less enlightened times, what we'd now recognize and label as significant intellectual disabilities that her family had treated as a shameful secret rather than a medical condition deserving compassion and appropriate support. Her parents had made the decision to institutionalize Nathan when he was only 8 years old, sending him away to a facility 3 states over and explicitly forbidding young Constance from ever mentioning him again to anyone, from visiting, from acknowledging in any way that she'd once had a little brother who had loved her absolutely and unconditionally. The shame and guilt in her voice as she recounted this history was profound and physical, like the words were literally cutting her throat on their way out into the space between us. She'd carried this terrible secret through our entire marriage, through dating and engagement and wedding and raising our own children, through building the life we'd shared, utterly convinced that if she told me the truth about Nathan, I would think less of her for not fighting harder to save him, for choosing compliance and self-preservation over courage, when she'd been just a frightened teenager herself with no power or resources. When her elderly parents had finally died 15 years ago, Constance had immediately begun searching for Nathan, spending months tracking him through various institutions and facilities, and had eventually located him in a group home 2 states away, miraculously still alive against considerable odds, still remembering the sister who'd disappeared completely from his life over 60 years earlier. She'd been visiting him monthly ever since that reunion, she explained, supporting him financially to improve his quality of life, trying desperately to make some kind of amends for literal decades of abandonment that hadn't really been her fault but that she'd carried guilt for nonetheless. The stranger in our bedroom, the man I'd watched with such jealousy and suspicion, wasn't a romantic rival at all. His name was Marcus, and he was a professional photographer. Constance had hired specifically to document Nathan's current life, to create a comprehensive visual history of the brother she'd lost and miraculously found again after so many years. The hidden photographs I'd seen her displaying on her phone were images of Nathan through the years, pictures she'd painstakingly obtained from various institutions and group homes, tangible evidence of a life that had continued in her absence, largely forgotten by everyone except the sister who'd never stopped feeling guilty. She'd been showing them to Marcus, she explained, helping him understand who Nathan truly was beyond his diagnosis, what he meant to her, collaborating on creating a beautiful memorial album while there was still time because Nathan was seriously sick now, his heart failing, the doctors having given him only months to live, at best. All of this spilled out of Constance in an unstoppable torrent of confession and tears while I sat completely paralyzed, trying desperately to recalibrate my entire understanding of the woman I'd married, the marriage I thought we'd built, the life I believed we'd been living together. She hadn't been unfaithful in any conventional sense. She'd been grieving and drowning in guilt and trying desperately to fix something that had been profoundly broken long before she'd ever met me. The relief I initially felt at learning there was no affair was immediately complicated by a new pain, somehow sharper and more cutting than simple jealousy would have been. She hadn't trusted me enough to share this. For 49 years, she'd carried this enormous burden, completely alone, utterly convinced that I wouldn't understand or forgive or love her enough to help shoulder the weight of her painful past. What kind of marriage had we really had if she'd felt such a fundamental need to hide something so essential to who she was? What had I done, or failed to do, that made her believe I couldn't handle the complete truth of her history and identity? The questions hurt worse than any affair could have, cutting at the very foundation of what I'd believed our relationship was built on. I told Constance about the cameras that same night, unable to keep my own shameful secret after she'd finally shared hers, after I'd realized with painful clarity that surveillance and suspicion were desperately poor substitutes for the honest communication we'd somehow lost along the complicated way. I expected immediate anger when I confessed what I'd done, righteous fury and feelings of betrayal, the same hurt I'd felt watching her with Marcus. Instead, she laughed, a sound edged with both hysteria and relief, and admitted she'd known about the cameras since the second day of their installation, had immediately noticed the new smoke detector that didn't quite match the existing ones, the picture frame positioned at an uncharacteristically odd angle, the decorative clock that had mysteriously appeared overnight in her craft room. She deliberately let me watch her, she explained, curious about what I thought I'd discover, whether I'd eventually confront her directly or continue hiding behind technology rather than simply talking to her face to face like adults who'd supposedly built a life together. We'd both been spying on each other in different ways. She observed with painful accuracy, me with cameras and her with strategic silence. Both of us absolutely terrified of genuine honesty, because real honesty required a level of vulnerability we'd somehow forgotten how to access after decades of comfortable routine. We sat together on that living room couch until nearly 3 in the morning, talking more honestly and openly than we had in years, possibly more honestly than we ever had in our entire relationship if I was being completely truthful with myself. Constance told me everything about Nathan's childhood, about the sweet, gentle boy who'd loved building elaborate towers with wooden blocks and listening to her read picture books, who'd been literally torn from their home, screaming her name while she hid terrified in her room, too young and powerless and afraid to say goodbye properly. She told me about the suffocating guilt that had shaped and distorted her entire adult life, the way she'd thrown herself obsessively into being an absolutely perfect wife and mother, as if somehow that could atone for failing to be a good sister when it had mattered most, how she'd kept Nathan's existence secret because admitting to it meant admitting to her own perceived cowardice, and she couldn't bear the thought of seeing disappointment or judgment in my eyes. I told her about the profound loneliness of retirement, about the disturbing feeling of becoming progressively invisible in my own life, about my fear that she'd stopped genuinely needing me now that I no longer had the clear purpose and identity provided by my career. We cried together, really cried, held each other for the first time in months, with actual conscious intention rather than mere habit, and began the difficult, uncertain work of rebuilding trust we'd spent years eroding through accumulated assumptions and protective silence. I met Nathan 2 weeks later when Constance finally felt ready to introduce us. She drove me to the group home where he lived, in a sunny corner room decorated absolutely everywhere with drawings he'd made, simple but genuinely joyful explosions of color that covered every available wall surface. He was 61 years old chronologically, but had the enthusiastic, unguarded energy of someone much younger, immediately grabbing my hand the moment we were introduced and pulling me excitedly over to show me his latest artistic creation, a crayon drawing of what he proudly announced was his sister, my Constance, rendered in vibrant purples and golds that somehow captured something essential about her despite the crude technique. He told me rambling stories in simple, fragmented sentences about the sister who visited him regularly, who brought him his favorite chocolate and helped him with jigsaw puzzles, who'd come back into his life like an absolute miracle after so many years of painful absence he'd stopped believing she'd ever return. The love in his voice when he spoke about Constance was completely uncomplicated and pure, utterly without resentment for all the lost decades, without bitterness about abandonment. He'd forgiven her, or perhaps had never blamed her in the first place, understanding in his straightforward way that sometimes people leave and sometimes they come back, and both things can simultaneously be true without canceling each other out or requiring complex explanations. Watching Constance interact with Nathan, seeing the profound tenderness in how she helped him explain his drawings to me, how she laughed genuinely at his simple jokes and held his hand with fierce protectiveness, I felt myself falling in love with her again, or maybe understanding for the first time who she truly was beneath all the roles we'd assigned each other over the decades. She wasn't just my wife, the mother of my children, the woman who efficiently managed our household and patiently tolerated my various quirks and failures. She was someone with her own deep pain and complicated history and hard-won courage, someone who'd made serious mistakes and was genuinely trying to fix them, despite knowing some things can never be fully repaired, someone absolutely worthy of being known completely rather than only partially. I started joining Constance on her visits to Nathan, becoming part of his small circle of people who made his limited world brighter and safer. We'd sit together in his sunny room, the three of us, looking at his drawings or doing puzzles or just talking about simple things that made him happy. I watched my wife with her brother and saw dimensions of her I'd never known existed, patience and gentleness and a capacity for unconditional love that she'd apparently kept hidden in a separate compartment of her heart for 6 decades. Nathan died 6 weeks after I met him, his failing heart finally giving out completely on a quiet Tuesday morning, while Constance sat beside his bed reading him the same simple stories she'd read when they were children, when the world was different, and she hadn't yet learned that love sometimes requires impossible choices. I was there too, having taken to joining all her visits, and I held her hand while we watched him slip away. His last words were, "Sister came back," said with a smile that made his entire face luminous with joy and peace. And then he was gone, leaving so quietly and gently we almost didn't notice the exact moment of transition from life to death. We buried Nathan in the plot Constance had purchased years ago, positioned directly next to the spaces she'd reserved for both of us. The brother finally reunited with family in death in the way he'd been cruelly denied throughout most of his life. At the small funeral, attended only by us and Marcus and a few caring staff members from Nathan's group home, Constance spoke movingly about second chances, about how it's never genuinely too late to do the right thing even if you can't undo the original wrong, about love being something you choose actively and repeatedly rather than feel once passively and assume will somehow sustain itself forever without effort. The cameras are gone now, dismantled and discarded. I took them down the day after our long confession, removing my surveillance system and returning somewhat nervously to the fundamental uncertainty of trust. It's harder this way, not knowing exactly what Constance does during every moment when I'm not physically present, having faith instead of evidence, belief instead of proof. But it's also infinitely better, more honest, built on the hard-won understanding that people are entitled to private thoughts and personal spaces even within marriage. That genuine love means believing in someone's fundamental goodness, even when you can't see or monitor every corner of their interior life. We talk now, really talk, about things that genuinely scare us and excite us and confuse us about growing old together in a world that seems increasingly foreign. Constance started a support group for families dealing with institutionalization guilt, channeling her painful experience with Nathan into helping others navigate similar complicated emotions. I joined a community woodworking shop, finding renewed purpose in creating useful things with my hands, building furniture for families who can't afford it, and remembering that usefulness and worth aren't tied exclusively to job titles or professional identity. The moral I've learned through all of this is deceptively simple, but profoundly true. Surveillance might show you what someone does, but only genuine vulnerability shows you who they actually are. I could have spent years watching Constance through hidden cameras, meticulously collecting evidence of her secret life, building an airtight case against her, based on partial information and fearful suspicion. I would have missed the truth entirely. The beautiful and painful and impossibly complicated truth of a woman trying desperately to atone for the past while building a meaningful future, carrying guilt that wasn't entirely hers to carry, but doing the hard work of redemption anyway. Trust isn't about knowing everything, about having complete information and perfect transparency. It's about believing that what you don't know isn't designed to hurt you, that the person you love is fundamentally worthy of benefit of doubt even when limited evidence seems potentially damning. It's choosing conversation over assumption, choosing to ask direct questions instead of drawing convenient conclusions, choosing to be wrong about your worst fears rather than right about them and losing everything in the process. If I'd confronted Constance with angry accusations instead of giving her safe space to confess on her own terms, if I'd let jealousy and suspicion poison the opportunity for real understanding, I would have lost not just her, but the precious chance to meet Nathan, to be part of his final months, to witness the kind of love that survives decades and distance and profound hurt. I'm reading and replying to every comment under this post, so please share your thoughts. Tell me honestly, have you ever kept a significant secret from someone you loved, either to protect them or to protect yourself? Have you ever discovered that someone you thought you knew completely was actually a mystery? And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because these stories matter and I want to keep sharing them with people who understand that life is complicated and messy and worth examining honestly, even when honesty hurts.